Hey, welcome. Today we're going to take another look at the block bindings API. This is the API that lets you take normal core blocks and sort of bind them to things like custom fields or site settings or like plugin integrations. And so it's a way to take like core blocks, show custom data in there and not have to build a bunch of blocks from scratch, which is sort of the way that a lot of developers have been approaching it. So it's a super handy feature. I went through it in another video in the past where we kind of looked at it with ACF. Part of the issue with block bindings API is there's no like user interface to actually do the work. So it's a really under the hood feature. If you want to mess around with it, you have to turn the WordPress block editor into like code editing mode and add a bunch of like JSON stuff in there. So not the greatest user experience because that's just not part of this release yet. That's still being worked on. That said, there is a way you can actually now use this and give a really good user experience with the block bindings API. And that's using something called block variations. Okay, so I'm pulling up a sample custom post type here. This is a book custom post type that we used in the last demo video. And part of the setup was that we had a custom post type about books, and then we had some custom fields down here where we had some custom values that each book might have, like an ISBN number, a link to purchase it on Amazon, and a link to purchase it on Goodreads. So a couple custom fields tied to a custom post type, pretty standard use case for the block bindings API, because let's say I want to have some buttons on here to link to Amazon and Goodreads, and I just, all this data is being handled under the hood or by an API or somewhere else, and I don't want to have to like add the buttons manually every time, or maybe I'm doing this in a template like a query loop and I want it to pull in that data automatically. That's where the block bindings API came in. So if you remember in the past video, you had to switch into code editing mode, but what you can actually do is create a block variation. And what a block variation does is it takes a core block and it just like presets some of the settings. So I'm going to go to the block inserter, and you're going to see right here I have this ISBN block, and I'm going to enter it. And this is not a custom block, it's just the core paragraph block. So if I go to the list view, it's just a paragraph just like this. But you can see with the purple little kind of link icon here, and you can see the way that the block is outlined in purple, it's actually locked to something, it's bound to something. So I can't come in here and edit it the way that I could with this paragraph, because it's actually pulling the binding data automatically from this custom field. So for the user, it's a really nice experience because they don't have to do anything. They can just come in here and just find the one that they're looking for and add it. And under the hood, what you've done is pre-built the block with all this kind of like stuff you have to stick in there for the block bindings API, which we're going to look at in a minute. And so that's one approach. Then we also had those two links. So I have another one called book buttons. And this is another variation. I'm going to insert it here. And this is, you'll notice that it's a buttons block that holds multiple buttons. And it's just pretty standard buttons block. And then inside, each individual button block has that same icon right there showing that it's a linked, bound value. And what that means is that we're actually letting you edit the content of the button. We could lock that as well, but we're not, we're letting that be editable. But the URL, you'll notice there's no URL here. That URL is gone, and that's because we're pulling that directly from the custom field. So like I said, the user experience can feel really good with block bindings API. You just can't edit this without going back into code. But again, like that UI will come. This is just a really nice way to offer it in maybe a project that you're working on. Maybe you have a plugin and you want to add some custom blocks with some values, but you don't want to like make the user have to type it in manually. So those are the kind of good use cases for the block bindings API. So the way we do this is with block variations. We're going to dig into the code and just show how you can sort of take what looks like, let's go to the code editor again, this right here with all this stuff in there, and how you can just offer it as a much nicer experience inside the block inserter. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a custom plugin, but you could also do this in a theme or wherever else you're doing. I don't know if you're using a code snippets plugin, not that I recommend that. But basically, there's a few things that have to be done for this to work. Number one is, in this example, we're binding to custom fields. So there are other places where you can like pull data from. In this example, we're doing custom fields or post meta. But what's important is that you have to actually make sure you register the post meta using just this core WordPress register post meta function. So in the example and in the previous live stream, I had used ACF. As of the time I'm recording this now, that method does not actually work anymore with ACF. Like it does, but it doesn't. You still have to actually, with WordPress core, register your post meta. And so you can see here, I've registered 3 meta fields on my book custom post type. I have ISBN, Amazon, and Goodreads. And then what's also important is that for those post meta fields, I'm showing them in the REST API. The block bindings API and really a lot of things in the block editor live off of the REST API. So you just have to make sure that these are showing up in the REST API. So I've registered 3 custom post meta fields. Chances are this is something you've already done if you're this far along in the process. And I'm making sure that I'm adding those when WordPress initializes, but also when the REST API initializes, just a weird side effect of registering post. Okay, so there's 2 ways to do block variations. And what a block variation really is it's just a block in WordPress where you've predefined some settings, you've pre-populated some content, or you've pre-checked some of the block supports, or you've pre-populated it with inner blocks. A good example of a block variation, I guess, would be maybe like when you add a columns block and you can kind of do like, it gives you those options of like 3 columns, 2 columns, you know, whatever. Like it's just one columns block, but it's giving you a couple variations that you get to pick from. And that sort of trickles down into how the block works. So that's what we're doing. So we'll look at the JavaScript method next. That's commented out here. We're going to start with it with the PHP method because I think that's what most people are going to want to do. And just a quick side note about it. The reason that there is a JavaScript and a PHP method is that the block variation itself really only exists inside the block editor. Like once you, like a block variation is just something that shows up in the block inserter that you get to pick. But once it's inside the post, it's just a normal block. Like a block variation is just a tool inside the block editor to preset some blocks. So when they originally made it, it really only existed kind of as JavaScript. There was only a JavaScript version of the function, and you would have to do these weird filters and stuff to get it to work. They've sort of streamlined that. At the end of the day, I would love to see like register block variation as a single function, and I think one day that will come. But right now, what you actually have, the best approach is a filter. I'm going to come all the way down, called get block type variations. This is a filter that kind of runs, and when block.json runs, it's going to let you filter and add additional variations. So this is the filter. It gives us 2 parameters. It gives us variations array. So these are all the variations that already exist on a block. And then it tells you the block type, which is like the kind of core structure, like is it a paragraph block? Is it a, you know, group block, et cetera, et cetera. So that way you can assign your variations to the correct block. So in this example, the first thing we're doing is checking if the block type is a core paragraph block. And if it is, then we're going to add to the variations array an additional variation. And so block variations can do a lot of different things. They can change, like you can do a variation where you predefine some colors, you predefine some spacing, you predefine all that sort of stuff. In this example, what we're doing is we're making a new variation. There's the name of it. That's just kind of under the hood. We have the title, which is what you see in the block inserter. And then we have an icon. So you don't have to do this, but notice that I did a custom icon where I pulled a dash icon of a book and I put that in there. So it just kind of is a nice like way to make it stick out a little bit more. And then I'm passing some attributes to the block. And so this is where you really do a lot of stuff with a block with a block variation. I could do different attributes. Like I want it to be wide aligned. I want it to be, you know, a dark background color, all that sort of stuff. So what we're doing is we're basically adding some metadata. What are we binding? We're binding the content. And then this is kind of the main argument here where we're saying here for the content of this paragraph, go to this source. And there's a bunch of different sources. You go to the documentation, you'll see kind of the different examples. And then eventually I think plugins are going to register their own source. So you'll probably see like an ACF one here eventually, or pods. And then it's basically, this is the source and then some additional arguments. And the main argument we're passing is what is the key? So like basically what we're saying here is take the content, replace it with a post meta where the meta key equals ISBN. And so it's going to go into your custom fields, pull that out. So this key right here really needs to match the name of the post meta up here. So that's what's really important. So that's really all that you really need to do. And in the previous example, when you're doing it in the block editor, all we were really literally doing was taking this and sticking it in there as like a JSON string. So it's kind of just an alternate version of that. Now let's do the little trickier one. The trickier one is the core/buttons variation. So if you remember when we put it in the user interface, it actually put 2 buttons in there because those are inner blocks. So we're going to make a new variation for the buttons block. We're just calling it book buttons. That's just what we're naming it. We're giving it that same book icon from the dash icons. And instead of passing custom attributes to the core, the buttons block, we're actually going to predefine some inner blocks. So we're going to say when they use this variation, put these 2 blocks already inside of it. And so that's where we're able to do this array of inner blocks. And you'll notice we have 2 inner blocks. They're both a core/button inner block. And then with those, I can pass an array of like the attributes that I want to set. So I could do attributes to the parent block, but like this is a block variation of inner blocks. It's like a more complicated example, which is why I wanted to show it. And you might be thinking, well, why don't I just make a variation of a single button block? You can do that, but you can't add a single button block from the WordPress. Let me show you why in the editor. So I can add a block buttons variation with these 2 buttons inside of it. But if I wanted to add a variation for a single button, like that's not going to show up here because you don't add a single button here. You add the buttons block. You would have to click, if I click here, the single button would show up here. And so it would actually give you the option to do the variation here. It's just not as great of a user experience, and that's why I'm not including it. I think it makes more sense for the buttons to just do it for the buttons block. You could do it either way, or you could do both. There's no reason not to do both, but just to be clear, that's why we're doing, so our block variation for the buttons block is the whole container with the 2 inner blocks inside of it. Let's go back to this code. So now you can see we've passed inner blocks as what we want this variation to have, and each one will have the core/button. So we have 2 buttons, and then the attributes that we're passing are, again, the same thing. We have metadata. We want some bindings in our metadata. We are binding the URL this time, not the content. So the URL is the actual link destination of the button. And at the same place, the source is from our post meta. It's coming from a custom, field. And this time the key is Amazon, which is the post meta field that we stored that URL in. And then you can see down here, we're actually pre-filling the button's text with Amazon. So that way when they insert the button, they know which button is which. They can change the text. We're not binding it. We're leaving it editable, but it's there. And the same thing for our Goodreads button. And then we're just going to make sure we return the full array because this is a filter. So we need to make sure we're returning that variations array. And that's adding block type variations. So at the end of the day, it's actually pretty simple to do if you're already in the place of like doing custom plugins and stuff like that, and you have custom post types. This is a really great way to, in a few lines of code, give scaffolds of specific buttons and even like style them a little bit more and that sort of thing. And then the block binding just happens under the hood. It can't be broken. It can't be changed unless they go into the code editor mode. Super handy. And then I'll show briefly if you are in a JavaScript build process. So in this case, this is a piece of JavaScript that I've done with a build process. I'm not going to go, I have other videos that go into depth about that, but I just wanted to show if you do want to do it in JavaScript and you are enqueuing JavaScript to the block editor, that is an option. I'm going to go over to the index.js. And in that version, you actually do get a register block variation function that comes from the WordPress blocks package. I won't go too in depth on it, but you can see that it's actually very similar. So here is the core/paragraph, and then here's the object basically of different settings. But again, it's the same. All the settings are exactly the same. Everything is laid out the same. So it's very similar. This is just if you have a JavaScript build process already, you could probably do this. There's really no reason not to. I don't know. I don't really have a preference, but if you're in the middle of doing a build process, this is kind of handy. But you can see here, it's all a lot of the same stuff. The inner blocks array that's being passed for the core buttons and all the same stuff. And then I'll just also note in this version, I did do a single variation of the individual button. It's not like the best experience, but it's pretty handy. So that's block Bindings API with block variations. It's a super handy tool where if you're willing to scaffold a little bit of code in your plugin or theme, then your users can actually insert blocks very easily and they're kind of controlled. So the value here is not doing it for a one-time add to your website. If you're going to do that, just stick it in the block editor. But if you are trying to give a better experience that you think people are going to be putting these blocks in multiple times and you want a more streamlined experience, that's the way to go. And then I'm looking forward to one day having this sort of built into the UI, built in with plugins like ACF, all those sorts of things, and the workload being a lot easier. And if you have any questions or other ideas for block bindings API or block variations, just let me know in the comments below and subscribe for my next video. Thank you for watching.